Blood-red dust swirled across the Arizona territory as Grace Verrill clutched the letter that had shattered her world, the crisp white paper a stark contrast to the chaos of her thoughts. It was 1883, and at 20 years old, she had just been informed by her father that she was no longer his daughter-all because she had fallen in love with a man whose only crime was being born on the wrong side of the tracks. The late afternoon sun beat down on Grace's shoulders as she stood at the edge of Eagar, Arizona, a small settlement nestled in the rugged terrain of Apache County. Her valise sat beside her, containing everything she owned in the world. 3 dresses, a hairbrush, a small Bible, and a brooch that had belonged to her mother. The stagecoach that had brought her here from Phoenix had already disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving her alone with the whispers of the wind and the distant sound of a saloon piano. Grace tucked the letter into her pocket and lifted her chin. Her father, Edmund Verrill, wealthy railroad investor and self-proclaimed pillar of Phoenix society, had made himself perfectly clear. She had disgraced the family by refusing to marry Harold Wellington, the son of his business partner. Instead, she had given her heart to Matthew Cooper, a humble blacksmith whose hands were calloused from honest work rather than soft from counting money. "You choose him, and you are no Verrill," her father had declared, his voice as cold as a mountain stream in winter. No daughter of mine would stoop so low. What her father couldn't understand was that Matthew's touch had awakened something in Grace that no amount of money or status could replicate. His gentle laugh, his unwavering integrity, and the way he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world had made her feel truly alive. But now Matthew was gone. A robbery at his shop had ended with a bullet in his chest, and Grace's world had collapsed. When she had refused to marry Harold even after Matthew's death, her father had finally made good on his threat. Grace blinked back tears as she scanned the main street of Eagar. She had chosen this remote town because her mother's sister lived here, or at least she had 5 years ago when they had last received correspondence. Aunt Martha was her last hope, the only family who might take her in. "Miss, you look like you could use some help." The voice was deep and rich like good whiskey. Grace turned to see a tall man astride a chestnut stallion. His broad shoulders were dusted with the same red soil that covered everything in this part of the country, and his face was partially obscured by the brim of his hat. What she could see was sun-weathered and kind. "I'm looking for Martha Simmons," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. "She's my aunt." The man's expression shifted, something somber settling in his eyes. "Martha Simmons passed on last winter. The fever took her and several others." Grace felt her knees weaken. Her last anchor had slipped away, leaving her adrift in an unfamiliar sea. "I see," she managed, though she didn't see at all. She didn't see anything beyond the narrowing tunnel of her vision as black spots danced before her eyes. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, crossing the distance between them just in time to catch her as she swayed. "Whoa there," he said, his hands strong and sure on her shoulders. "When's the last time you ate something, miss?" Grace couldn't remember. The journey had been long and food had been the last thing on her mind. "I'm fine," she insisted, though the trembling in her limbs betrayed her. "You're about as fine as a cactus in a rainstorm," he replied, a gentle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I'm Yates Jenkins." "Most folks around here call me Yates." "Grace Verrill," she said automatically, then corrected herself. "Just Grace now, I suppose." Yates raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Instead, he picked up her valise with one hand while keeping the other at her elbow. "Let's get you something to eat, Miss Grace, then we can figure out what's next." "There is no next," Grace admitted, too exhausted to maintain any pretense. "My aunt was my last hope. I have nowhere to go." Yates studied her face, his eyes the same warm brown as the earth after a spring rain. "Everyone's got somewhere to go," he said finally. "Sometimes they just don't know it yet. Come on." He led her to his horse and helped her up before mounting behind her. The solid warmth of him at her back was both strange and comforting, and Grace found herself leaning slightly into his strength as they rode toward a whitewashed building with a sign that read, "Jenkins General Store." "You own this place?" Grace asked as they came to a stop. Me and my brother Caleb, Yates confirmed, helping her down. He handles most of the store business. I manage our ranch outside of town. The interior of the store was cool and dim after the harsh sunlight, smelling of coffee, leather, and the sweet tang of peppermint candy. A man who looked remarkably like Yates, though perhaps a few years younger, stood behind the counter, weighing coffee beans for a woman in a faded blue dress. "Caleb, this is Miss Grace," Yates said by way of introduction. "She needs some food and a place to sit for a spell." Caleb looked up, his expression shifting from casual interest to concern as he took in Grace's appearance. "Of course. Sarah, would you mind showing Miss Grace to the back room? There's some stew on the stove." The woman in blue nodded, giving Grace a kind smile. "Come with me, honey. You look like you've had quite a journey." Grace followed Sarah through a doorway into a small but tidy kitchen. A pot of something fragrant simmered on the stove, and a round table with 4 chairs occupied the center of the room. Sarah ladled stew into a bowl and placed it before Grace along with a thick slice of bread. "Eat up," she encouraged. "Caleb's wife makes the best venison stew in the territory." Grace hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first spoonful of rich, savory stew touched her lips. She ate with single-minded focus, barely aware of the conversation happening in hushed tones just beyond the door. "Her aunt was Martha Simmons," Yates was saying. "Looks like she's come from somewhere far with nowhere to go. Poor thing," came Caleb's reply. "What do you aim to do about it?" There was a pause before Yates answered. "Don't rightly know yet, but I can't just leave her to fend for herself, not with those vultures over at Blackwell's saloon always looking for fresh girls." Grace's hand trembled at the implication. She had heard stories of young women without means or protection being forced into lives of degradation. Her spoon clattered against the bowl. Sarah, who had been quietly arranging items on a shelf, turned at the sound. "Don't you worry about a thing," she said firmly. "The Jenkins brothers are good men. They won't let any harm come to you." Grace wanted to believe her, but experience had taught her that kindness often came with expectations. "Why would they help me? They don't even know me." Sarah's smile was genuine. "That's just how they are, especially Yates. He's got a heart bigger than the whole territory. Lost his wife and baby 5 years back during childbirth, and instead of turning bitter, he just seems more determined to help folks in need." Before Grace could respond, the door opened, and Yates entered with Caleb close behind, feeling better. Yates asked, his eyes taking in the now empty bowl. Grace nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "Thank you for your kindness, both of you." Caleb waved away her thanks. "It's nothing." "Now, about your situation, I can work," Grace interrupted quickly. "I can cook, clean, so." "I'm a quick learner if there's something specific you need done around the store." The brothers exchanged a glance, and something unspoken passed between them. "Actually," Yates said slowly, "I've been looking for someone to help out at the ranch. The house needs tending, and I've got a young girl there who could use some looking after while I'm working the land." Grace's brow furrowed. "Your daughter?" A shadow crossed Yates' face. "No, Emma's my ward. Her parents were killed in a raid 3 years back. She was the only survivor." "I'm sorry," Grace said softly. Yates nodded his acknowledgement. "She's 8 now, bright as a new penny but wild as a Mustang. Could use a woman's influence." He paused. "It wouldn't be charity, Miss Grace. You'd earn your keep, and I'd pay you fair wages besides." Grace hesitated, weighing her options, though in truth she had none. "I accept your offer, Mr. Jenkins." "Yates," he corrected gently. "If we're going to be sharing a roof, might as well use my given name." "Yates," she echoed, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "Good," he said with a decisive nod. "We'll head out tomorrow morning. Tonight you can stay with Sarah and Caleb. They've got a spare room since their oldest moved out." And just like that, Grace found herself with a roof over her head and the prospect of employment. As she followed Sarah to her home a short distance from the store, she couldn't help but wonder at the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this place. That night, as she lay in a borrowed nightgown in a narrow but comfortable bed, Grace unfolded her father's letter once more. The words were no less harsh for being read a dozen times. "You have made your choice, and in doing so, you have removed yourself from this family. Do not write. Do not return. You are no longer a Verrill." Grace folded the letter carefully and tucked it beneath her pillow. Tomorrow she would begin again. Tomorrow she would find out what it meant to be just Grace. The journey to Yates Ranch took the better part of the morning. Grace sat beside him on the wagon seat, her valise and a few supplies from the store secured in the back. The land around them was both beautiful and harsh rolling hills covered in scrubby vegetation, jagged mountains in the distance, and a sky so vast and blue it made her heart ache. "It's not what you're used to, I expect," Yates commented as they bounced over a particularly rough stretch of road. "Town life is different." Grace thought about the stifling propriety of her father's house, the endless round of social calls and careful conversations where nothing of substance was ever said. "I think I might prefer it out here," she admitted. "There's an honesty to it." Yates gave her a curious look. "Most city folks find it too quiet, too much space to get lost in your thoughts." "Maybe that's what I need," Grace said softly. "Space to think my own thoughts instead of the ones I'm supposed to have." Something in Yates' expression shifted, a new understanding perhaps, but he said nothing more as they crested a hill and the ranch came into view. It wasn't grand by any measure, but there was a solidity to the main house that spoke of careful craftsmanship. A large barn stood nearby, along with several corrals and smaller outbuildings. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, and a small garden plot was visible to one side of the house. "It's not much," Yates said, a note of pride in his voice despite his modest words, "but it's home." As the wagon rolled into the yard, the front door of the house flew open, and a small figure darted out. The girl was a whirlwind of movement, her dark hair streaming behind her as she ran toward them. "Yates, you're back," she called, skidding to a halt beside the wagon. Her eyes, wide and curious, fixed on Grace. "Who's she?" "Emma, mind your manners," Yates chided gently. "This is Miss Grace. She's going to be helping around the house and looking after you when I'm busy with the ranch." Emma's expression clouded. "I don't need looking after. I'm not a baby." "No, you surely aren't," Yates agreed, climbing down from the wagon before coming around to help Grace. "But even grown-ups need company sometimes. Miss Grace has come a long way and she'll be staying with us for a while." Emma studied Grace with undisguised suspicion. "Where's your family?" The question, innocent though it was, struck Grace like a physical blow. "There. Not here," she managed, forcing a smile. Something in her voice must have communicated more than her words because Emma's expression softened slightly. "Mine aren't here either," she said with the straightforward acceptance of a child who had already faced life's harshest truths. Yates placed a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder. "Why don't you show Miss Grace around the house while I unload the wagon? Then we can all have some lunch." Emma seemed to consider this suggestion carefully before nodding. "I guess I can do that." She turned and marched toward the house without checking to see if Grace was following. "She's been through a lot," Yates said quietly. "Takes her time warming up to folks." Grace nodded her understanding. "So have I," she replied, then set off after the girl. The house was simple but comfortable, a large main room that served as both kitchen and living area with a stone fireplace along one wall. A hallway led to 3 bedrooms and a small washroom. Emma pointed out each space with the solemnity of an official tour guide. "That's Yates' room," she said, indicating the largest bedroom, "and that one's mine." The second room was smaller, with a colorful quilt on the bed and a collection of small treasures arranged on a shelf: a bird's nest, some pretty rocks, a doll with one arm missing. "And this," Emma continued, pointing to the third bedroom, "is where Miss Martha used to stay when she came to visit. I guess it's yours now." The room was sparsely furnished but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table beside the window. Someone, Yates, presumably had placed a jar of wildflowers on the table, a simple gesture of welcome that made Grace's throat tighten unexpectedly. "It's very nice," she said, running her hand over the patchwork quilt that covered the bed. Emma watched her closely. "Are you going to cry?" Grace blinked rapidly. "No, of course not." "It's okay if you do," Emma said with surprising gentleness. Yates says crying is just how the heart talks when words aren't enough. A tear slipped down Grace's cheek before she could stop it. "Your Yates is a wise man." Emma nodded sagely. "He's the best person in the whole world," she stated with absolute conviction, "but don't tell him I said so." He'll get a swelled head. Despite everything, Grace found herself laughing. Your secret is safe with me. The sound of boots on the porch signaled Yates' approach. House still standing, he called as he entered, arms full of supplies. We haven't burned it down yet, Emma replied cheerfully. But the day's still young. Yates chuckled, setting his burden on the kitchen table. Glad to hear it. Now, how about you two wash up while I start lunch? Old Hank left some biscuits and bacon before he rode into town. Who's Hank? Grace asked as she helped Emma pump water into a basin for washing. He helps around the ranch, Emma explained. He's ancient, at least 40, and he smells like tobacco, but he makes good biscuits. The three of them settled into an easy rhythm as they prepared and ate the simple meal. Grace was surprised at how comfortable it felt, sitting at this rough-hewn table with people who were strangers just hours ago. There was none of the rigid formality she had grown up with, just the honest hunger of people who worked hard and the pleasure of food shared in good company. After they had eaten, Yates explained what he hoped Grace would do around the ranch. Nothing too taxing, he assured her. Keep the house in order, help with meals, and make sure this one, he ruffled Emma's hair, doesn't run completely wild when I'm out with the cattle. Can you do that? Grace nodded. I believe I can manage. Good. I'll be out until sundown most days, but you can always find me if there's trouble. Emma knows where I'm likely to be. As Yates headed back out to finish his chores, Grace set about familiarizing herself with the kitchen. She found flour, sugar, and other staples in a small pantry, along with jars of preserved fruits and vegetables. It was modest compared to what she was accustomed to, but everything was clean and well organized. Emma hovered nearby, watching Grace's every move with curious eyes. Can you make pie? She asked suddenly. I can, Grace confirmed. Though I've never made one myself, I watched our cook do it many times. Emma's eyes lit up. Yates loves apple pie. If you made one, he'd probably let you stay forever. Grace smiled at the child's transparent attempt at matchmaking. Is that so? Emma nodded emphatically. He gets a special look on his face when he eats pie, like he's remembering something good. Well then, Grace said, rolling up her sleeves, perhaps we should see if there are any apples in that pantry. The rest of the afternoon passed in a flurry of activity as Grace and Emma worked together to create an apple pie. It wasn't perfect. The crust was a bit too thick in places, but it smelled heavenly as it baked in the oven. By the time Yates returned as the sun was setting, Grace had also prepared a simple supper of beans, corn bread, and the last of the bacon. She felt a strange sense of accomplishment as she set the table, something she had never done before coming here. Yates paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before him, the neatly set table, the food waiting to be served, and the unmistakable aroma of freshly baked pie. Something flickered in his eyes, too quick for Grace to identify. Well now, he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door, this is a welcome sight. Emma bounced excitedly in her chair. We made pie. Miss Grace showed me how to peel the apples all in one long strip. Did she now? Yates smiled, washing his hands at the basin before joining them at the table. You've been busy. I hope you don't mind, Grace said. I took the liberty of using some of your supplies. Mind? Yates looked genuinely puzzled. Why would I mind you making food that smells this good? They ate with hearty appetite, the conversation flowing easily. Yates told stories of the day's work, a troublesome calf that had gotten itself stuck in mud, a hawk that had been circling above the pasture all afternoon. Emma chattered about her adventures with Grace, making the pie sound like a grand expedition rather than a simple cooking lesson. Grace found herself relaxing, laughing at Emma's dramatic retelling of how flour had somehow ended up on the ceiling. When it was time for dessert, Grace cut 3 generous slices of pie and placed them on plates with a flourish. Yates took his first bite and closed his eyes, that special look Emma had described crossing his features. It was a look of simple pleasure, but also something deeper, a kind of peaceful remembrance. My mother used to make apple pie, he said after a moment, his voice soft. Not since I was a boy. This tastes like hers. Is that good? Grace asked uncertainly. Yates opened his eyes, and the warmth in them made something flutter in Grace's chest. It's perfect, he said simply. That night, After Emma had been tucked into bed with a story, Grace sat by the fire while Yates whittled a small piece of wood at the table. The comfortable silence between them was new to Grace, who had grown up in a home where silence usually meant disapproval. "May I ask you something?" She ventured finally. Yates looked up from his work. "Course you can. Why did you offer me this position? You don't know anything about me." Yates considered the question, turning the small piece of wood over in his calloused hands. "I know you were alone and in need," he said at last. "I know what that feels like. After Rebecca, my wife, died, I was lost. If it hadn't been for Caleb and some other good folks, I don't know where I'd be." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I believe that when you've been shown kindness, you're meant to pass it on, that's all." "It's a generous philosophy," Grace said softly. Yates shrugged. "It's the only one that makes sense to me." He returned to his whittling, and Grace watched the firelight play across his features. There was strength there, but gentleness too, and a quiet dignity that reminded her of Matthew in some ways. The comparison startled her. She had loved Matthew with all the passion of her young heart, had defied her family for him. His death had left her hollow, convinced she would never feel that way again. Yet here, in this simple ranch house with its scarred table and handmade quilts, something warm was kindling in that hollow space. Grace looked away from Yates, focusing instead on the dancing flames. It was too soon, she told herself. Too soon to be noticing the way his hands moved so surely, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the way his deep voice seemed to resonate in her very bones. "I should retire," she said abruptly, rising to her feet. "It's been a long day." Yates nodded, setting aside his whittling. "Sleep well, Miss Grace. Tomorrow's another day." As she settled into her bed that night, Grace could hear the soft sounds of Yates moving about the house, checking doors and windows before retiring himself. There was something profoundly comforting about that sound, about knowing someone was there, keeping watch. For the first time since she had received her father's letter, Grace slept deeply and without dreams. The days settled into a routine as spring gave way to summer. Grace threw herself into her new role with determination, learning the rhythms of ranch life. She discovered that she enjoyed the physical work, the satisfaction of kneading bread dough, the smell of clean laundry dried in the sun, the quiet pleasure of seeing a room transformed by her efforts. Emma proved to be both a challenge and a delight. The girl was fiercely independent, with a tendency to disappear for hours on end, only to return with her clothes torn and her hair full of twigs. Yet she was also hungry for knowledge, soaking up everything Grace could teach her about cooking, sewing, and the stories Grace remembered from her own childhood. As for Yates, he was a revelation. Grace had never known a man who worked so hard yet always had time for a kind word, who commanded respect without raising his voice, who treated both her and Emma with unfailing consideration. One evening, about a month after Grace's arrival, she was hanging freshly washed sheets on the line when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw a rider galloping toward the house, dust billowing behind him. Yates, who had been mending a fence nearby, straightened and shaded his eyes against the setting sun. "That's Tom Burke," he said, naming one of his ranch hands. "Something's wrong." He strode to meet the rider, and Grace couldn't hear their exchange, but she saw Yates' posture change, tension visible in every line of his body. "Miss Grace," he called, already moving toward the barn, "I need to ride out. One of the men's been hurt." Grace hurried to meet him as he saddled his horse. "What happened?" "Snakebite," Yates said grimly. "Sam was checking the south pasture and got too close to a rattler. Tom says it doesn't look good." "What can I do?" Grace asked, her heart racing with concern for a man she had met only once. Yates swung up into the saddle. "Keep an eye on Emma, and if you could have some hot water and clean bandages ready, we'll bring Sam here. The doctor in town is away until tomorrow." "Of course," Grace said immediately. "I'll prepare everything." With a nod of thanks, Yates spurred his horse and galloped away, Tom close behind. Grace worked quickly, heating water on the stove and gathering what medical supplies the house contained. Emma helped without being asked, her young face solemn as she tore strips of clean cloth for bandages. It was full dark by the time they heard the wagon approaching. Emma ran to light lanterns and place them on the porch while Grace put the final touches on her preparations. She had cleared the kitchen table and covered it with a clean sheet, remembering how her mother had done the same when the cook had badly burned her arm years ago. The door burst open, and Yates entered, helping to carry a pale, sweating man. Sam Moore was in his 30s, a quiet cowboy who had been with the ranch since before Yates took over. Now his face was gray with pain, his right leg swollen grotesquely below the knee where the snake had struck. "On the table," Grace directed, her voice calm despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. She had never treated a snake bite before, but she remembered reading about them. As they settled Sam on the table, Yates explained in terse sentences what they had already done. "Cut the wound and tried to suck out the poison. Gave him whiskey for the pain, but it's been hours." Grace nodded, examining the angry puncture marks surrounded by flesh that was swollen and discolored. "We need to clean it thoroughly," she said, "and keep the leg still and lower than his heart." She worked methodically, washing the wound with hot water and then applying a poultice of herbs she found in the pantry. Sam drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes crying out when the pain was too great. Emma hovered nearby, fetching fresh water or clean cloths whenever Grace asked. Yates stayed at Sam's side, his hand on the man's shoulder, speaking to him in low, reassuring tones. It was nearly dawn when Sam's fever finally broke. His breathing became more regular, and the swelling in his leg, while still severe, had stopped spreading. "He'll live," Grace said softly, wiping her brow with a weary hand. "But he'll need proper medical attention when the doctor returns." Yates nodded, relief evident in the slump of his shoulders. "Thank you," he said simply. They moved Sam to Yates' bed, as it would be easier to tend him there than on the kitchen table. Emma had finally succumbed to exhaustion and was curled up on a blanket near the fire. Yates carried her to her own bed before returning to the kitchen, where Grace was cleaning up the last traces of their long night's work. "You should rest," he told her, taking the cloth from her hands. "You've done enough." Grace shook her head. "I'll rest soon. I just want to finish this." Yates didn't argue, instead picking up another cloth and helping her. They worked in companionable silence until the kitchen was restored to its usual order. As they finished, Yates turned to face her. In the soft light of dawn filtering through the windows, his eyes were deep pools of emotion. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "Sam's been with me since the beginning. He's family." "You don't need to thank me," Grace replied. "I'm glad I could help." Yates took a step closer, closing the distance between them. "You did more than help. You saved his life." His voice was rough with exhaustion and something else, something that made Grace's pulse quicken. "I only did what needed doing," she said, suddenly very aware of how close he was standing. "That's what makes you special, Grace," Yates said softly. "You see what needs doing and you do it without fuss or complaint. You're the strongest woman I've ever known." No one had ever called her strong before. Beautiful, yes, accomplished in the ladylike arts, certainly, but never strong. The words settled around her like a mantle, fitting in ways she hadn't expected. "I'm not," she whispered. "I ran away when things got difficult." Yates shook his head. "No, you survived. There's a difference." He reached out slowly, as if giving her time to move away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His fingers were gentle against her skin, and Grace found herself leaning slightly into his touch. For a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, standing close in the quiet kitchen with the first light of day painting everything in soft gold. Grace could feel something shifting between them, a current of possibility that had been there from the beginning but was only now making itself known. Then Sam called out from the bedroom, the sound breaking the spell. Yates stepped back, his hand falling to his side. "I should check on him," he said, his voice returning to its normal register. "And you should get some sleep. Dr. Wilson should be back by noon, and I'll ride into town to fetch him then." Grace nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. "Wake me if you need anything before then." As she made her way to her room, Grace felt the ghost of Yates' touch on her cheek and wondered if she had imagined the look in his eyes. The following days were busy with Sam's recovery. Dr. Wilson confirmed that Grace's treatment had likely saved the cowboy's life, but he would need time to fully heal. Grace found herself tending to Sam during the day while Yates and the other ranch hands managed the increased workload. Emma appointed herself Grace's assistant, bringing water and food to the patient and regaling him with elaborate stories to pass the time. It was during one of these storytelling sessions that Grace first heard the full tale of how Emma had come to live with Yates. "My ma and pa had a small farm over by Silver Creek," Emma explained, perched on a stool beside Sam's bed. "One day, some bad men came. They wanted our land 'cause they thought there was silver on it." Her voice grew softer. "They shot my pa when he wouldn't sign some paper, then they shot ma too." Grace's heart clenched at the matter-of-fact way Emma recounted such horror. "I hid in the root cellar like ma told me to," Emma continued. "Stayed there all night. In the morning, Yates found me. He was tracking the bad men with some other ranchers. He wrapped me in his coat and took me home with him." Sam, who clearly knew the story well, added quietly, "Yates spent months making sure those men faced justice, wouldn't rest until every last one was behind bars or in the ground." Emma nodded. "He says I'm his family now." "That family isn't just blood, it's who you choose to love." The words echoed in Grace's mind long after Emma had moved on to other topics. Family as a choice, not merely an accident of birth. It was a revolutionary idea to someone who had been raised with the rigid Verrill family hierarchy. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Grace found Yates on the porch, smoking a rare cigarette as he gazed at the stars. She settled beside him on the bench, drawing her shawl closer against the night's chill. "Emma told me how she came to live with you," she said after a comfortable silence. Yates exhaled a stream of smoke. "Did she? She doesn't usually talk about it. She said you told her that family is who you choose to love." He nodded slowly. "That's what my mother always said. She was orphaned young, raised by her aunt and uncle. They weren't blood, but they were the best family she could have asked for." "It's a beautiful sentiment," Grace said. "Very different from how I was raised. In my father's house, family was a duty, an obligation. Love wasn't part of the equation." Yates turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful in the moonlight. "Is that why you left? Because of your father?" Grace had never told him the full story of why she had come to Eagar. Now, sitting beside him with the vast Arizona sky spread above them like a blanket of diamonds, the words came more easily than she expected. "I fell in love with a man my father didn't approve of," she began. "Matthew was a blacksmith, hardworking, honest, with plans to open his own shop. But he had no family connections, no fortune. My father wanted me to marry the son of his business partner, a match that would have been advantageous for the railroad he was investing in." Yates listened silently, his cigarette forgotten between his fingers. "When I refused, my father threatened to disown me. I didn't believe him at first, but then Matthew was killed during a robbery, and even in my grief, my father saw only an opportunity to press his advantage. When I still wouldn't agree to marry Harold, he cut me off completely." She took a shaky breath. "His letter arrived 3 months ago. That's when I decided to come here to find my aunt." "I'm sorry," Yates said quietly. "About Matthew, about your father." Grace blinked back tears. "The strange thing is, I've found more family here, among strangers, than I ever had in my father's house. Emma, Sam, even old Hank, you've all shown me more kindness in a few months than my father did in 20 years. Yates stubbed out his cigarette and hesitantly reached for her hand. His palm was warm and rough against her smoother skin. "You're not a stranger anymore, Grace. You're part of this place now, part of—" He hesitated, then continued, "part of our family, if you want to be." Grace looked down at their joined hands, feeling a sense of rightness that she hadn't expected. "I think I'd like that very much," she whispered. Yates' smile was slow and warm, like sunrise over the mountains. They sat together in comfortable silence until the moon was high overhead, their hands still linked, a tangible connection that spoke of possibilities neither was quite ready to name. As summer progressed, life on the ranch settled into a pleasant rhythm. Sam recovered enough to return to light duties, though he walked with a pronounced limp that Dr. Wilson said might never fully disappear. The cattle flourished in the summer pastures, and Yates spoke of a good profit at the fall market. For Grace, each day brought new discoveries about ranch life, about Emma's bright, inquisitive mind, and about Yates himself. She learned that he hummed under his breath when he was thinking hard about something, that he could identify birds by their calls alone, that he kept a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets beside his bed. She also discovered things about herself. That she was stronger than she had believed, more capable, more resilient. That she could solve problems without running to others for help, that her opinions were valued here, that her presence made a difference. And she discovered that her heart, which she had thought permanently broken by Matthew's death and her father's rejection, was healing. More than healing, it was expanding, making room for new attachments, new feelings that grew stronger with each passing day. The change in her relationship with Yates was subtle but unmistakable. There were lingering glances across the dinner table, hands that touched a moment longer than necessary when passing the salt, conversations that stretched late into the evening after Emma had gone to bed. Nothing had been declared, no promises made, but Grace felt the shift like the gradual changing of seasons, natural and inevitable. It was during the first cool days of autumn that the letter arrived. Grace was in the garden, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables with Emma's enthusiastic if somewhat haphazard assistance, when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Looking up, she saw a rider she didn't recognize, a young man in the dusty clothes of someone who had traveled far. Yates emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth as he went to meet the stranger. Grace couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw Yates accept a letter from the rider before directing him toward the house, where he would likely be offered refreshment before continuing his journey. There was something in Yates' posture as he looked at the letter that made Grace's stomach tighten with apprehension. He stood too still, his shoulders rigid in a way she had come to recognize as a sign of deep concern. "Emma, why don't you take these beans inside and wash them?" Grace suggested, keeping her voice light. "I'll be along in a moment." Emma glanced between Grace and the distant figures of Yates and the rider, clearly curious, but she picked up the basket without argument and headed for the house. Grace made her way across the yard to where Yates still stood, seemingly frozen in place, the letter clutched in his hand. "Yates," she said quietly, "is everything all right?" He looked up, and the expression on his face sent a chill through her. It was the look of a man who had received a blow he hadn't seen coming. "It's for you," he said, extending the letter. "From Phoenix." Grace's hands trembled as she took the envelope. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the return address belonged to her father's solicitor, Mr. Hargrove. With a sense of unreality, she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The message was brief and to the point. "Miss Verrill, I regret to inform you that your father, Edmund Verrill, suffered a fatal apoplexy on September 12, 1883. As executor of his estate, I am required to notify you that despite his previous communications, Mr. Verrill did not alter his will before his untimely death. As such, you remain his sole heir and beneficiary. Your presence is requested in Phoenix at your earliest convenience to discuss the settlement of the estate. Yours sincerely, Jonathan Hargrove, attorney at law." Grace read the words 3 times before they began to make sense. Her father was dead, she was his heir. The fortune, the railroad investments, the grand house in Phoenix, all of it was now hers. "Grace," Yates' voice seemed to come from very far away. "What is it?" She looked up at him, unable to form the words. Instead, she handed him the letter, watching as he scanned its contents. "Your father is dead," he said softly. "I'm sorry." Grace nodded mechanically. She should feel something: grief, relief, anger, but there was only a strange numbness, as if she were watching events unfold from a great distance. "You're wealthy now," Yates continued, his voice careful, neutral. "One of the richest women in the territory, I'd imagine." This observation penetrated the fog around Grace's mind. Wealthy, independent, free to go wherever she wanted, do whatever she pleased, no longer dependent on Yates' generosity or her own labor for survival. The realization should have brought joy, but instead it filled her with a nameless dread. What did this mean for her life here, for the connections she had formed, for the feelings that had been growing between her and Yates? "I need to go to Phoenix," she said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. Yates nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course, we can get you on the stage tomorrow. Will you?" Grace hesitated, suddenly unsure of her place in his life, of his feelings for her. "Will you come with me?" Something flickered in Yates' eyes, surprise, perhaps, or relief. "If you want me to," he said. "I do," Grace replied, more certain of this than anything else in that moment. "I don't want to face this alone." The rider who had brought the letter was happy to carry a message back to town, arranging for 2 seats on the next day's stagecoach to Phoenix. Sarah agreed to stay at the ranch with Emma, who protested vehemently until Yates promised to bring her back a special gift from the city. As they prepared for the journey, Grace found herself moving through a haze of conflicting emotions. Her father was dead. The man who had rejected her, who had cut her out of his life as cleanly as if she had never existed, was gone forever. There would be no reconciliation, no opportunity to understand each other better, no chance to heal the wounds that had driven them apart. Yet beneath the complicated grief was a current of anxiety about what would happen next. The life she had built at the ranch, the sense of belonging she had found with Yates and Emma, the simple rhythms that had come to define her days, all of it seemed suddenly precarious, threatened by the inheritance that should have represented freedom. The stagecoach journey to Phoenix was long and dusty, the road rough enough to rattle teeth. Yates sat beside Grace, a solid, reassuring presence. They spoke little during the journey, both lost in their own thoughts, but occasionally his hand would find hers, a brief touch of comfort that anchored her in the present. Phoenix was, much as Grace remembered it, a growing town with pretensions to grandeur. Its wide streets lined with an eclectic mix of modest adobe buildings and more imposing structures of brick and stone. As the stagecoach rolled down Washington Street, Grace felt a strange disconnection, as if the familiar sights belonged to someone else's memory rather than her own. Mr. Hargrove received them in his office, a somberly decorated room that smelled of leather-bound law books and expensive tobacco. He was a small, precise man with spectacles that caught the light as he moved, obscuring his eyes. "Miss Verrill," he greeted her, rising from behind his desk, "my condolences on your loss." His gaze shifted to Yates, a question in the lift of his eyebrow. "This is Yates Jenkins," Grace explained. "Friend, I would like him to stay for our discussion." If Mr. Hargrove found this unusual, he gave no sign beyond a slight inclination of his head. "As you wish, please be seated." What followed was a detailed accounting of her father's estate, the house on Adams Street, the shares in the Southwest Railroad Company, various investments and accounts, all now legally hers. The sums involved were staggering, far more than Grace had realized even growing up in a household of obvious wealth. "There is one other matter," Mr. Hargrove said, adjusting his spectacles. "A personal letter which your father instructed me to deliver to you in the event of his death." He withdrew an envelope from a drawer and placed it on the desk between them. Unlike the formal document she had received 3 months earlier, this envelope was addressed simply to Grace in her father's bold, angular handwriting. Grace stared at it, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. "Would you like a moment of privacy?" Mr. Hargrove inquired. Grace shook her head. "No, thank you, we'll be leaving now. I'll review everything and return tomorrow with any questions." Outside, the afternoon sun beat down on the dusty street, a stark contrast to the cool dimness of the lawyer's office. Grace clutched the envelope containing her father's last words to her, unable to open it just yet. "Where to now?" Yates asked quietly. Grace hesitated only a moment before answering. "Home. I want to see the house." The Verrill mansion stood on a corner lot, its white columned facade imposing against the desert landscape. A wreath of black crepe hung on the front door, a public symbol of mourning for a man whose absence Grace had already been living with for months. She stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the house where she had spent her childhood and youth. It was beautiful, certainly grand in a way that the simple ranch house could never be. Yet standing there, she felt none of the sense of homecoming she experienced every time she returned to the ranch after an errand in town. "Would you like to go inside?" Yates asked, standing respectfully at her side. Grace shook her head. "Not today, I'm not ready." Instead, they found rooms at a hotel on Central Avenue, a respectable establishment where Grace's name was recognized with a flurry of deference that made her uncomfortable after months of being treated as simply Miss Grace at the ranch. In the privacy of her room, Grace finally opened her father's letter. The paper was expensive, the ink black and precise, like everything Edmund Verrill had valued. "My dear Grace," it began, the endearment so unexpected that Grace had to pause, her eyes suddenly burning with unshed tears. "If you are reading this, I have departed this world without the opportunity to make amends for the grievous wrong I did you. Pride is a deadly sin, and mine has cost me the most precious thing in my life, my only child. I convinced myself that I was acting in your best interest, that a match with Harold Wellington would secure your future in ways that an alliance with a blacksmith could not. I told myself that my anger was righteous, that your defiance was a rejection of everything I had built for you. I was wrong. In the months since you left, I have come to see that what I truly feared was losing you to a life I could not control or understand. Your mother would be ashamed of me, and rightly so. She always said you had her spirit, her courage to follow your heart. I should have honored that inheritance instead of trying to bend you to my will. I learned of Matthew Cooper's death shortly after it occurred. I told myself I would write to you then, offer you a place back in my home without conditions. But each day I delayed, finding reasons why tomorrow would be better. Now there are no more tomorrows for me. Whatever life you have built for yourself, I hope it brings you joy. Know that despite my failings as a father, my love for you never wavered, even when my pride would not let me admit it. All that I have is yours. Use it well and be happier than I was. Your loving father, Edmund Verrill." Grace let the letter fall to her lap, tears flowing freely now. All these months, she had carried the weight of her father's rejection, believing herself cut off from his heart as well as his fortune. To learn now that he had regretted his actions, that he had loved her still, was both a balm and a fresh wound. A knock at the connecting door startled her from her thoughts. "Grace," Yates' voice was concerned. "Are you all right?" She crossed the room and opened the door. Yates stood there, his tall frame filling the doorway, his expression troubled. "I heard." He began, then stopped, seeing her tears. "Ah, Grace." Without a word, she stepped into his embrace, burying her face against his chest as sobs shook her body. Yates held her gently, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring soft words of comfort as she grieved not just for her father's death, but for the reconciliation that would never happen, the years of estrangement that could never be undone. When the storm of emotion finally passed, Grace stepped back, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to fall apart like that." "Don't apologize," Yates said. "Grief needs its time, same as anything else." Grace handed him the letter. "He was going to write to me," she said as he read. "He was sorry." Yates finished reading and looked up, his eyes soft with understanding. "He loved you, that's clear." "Too late," Grace said, fresh tears threatening. "It's all too late." Yates shook his head, "Not all of it. You know now that he regretted what happened, that's something, at least." Grace nodded slowly. He was right. It was something, not everything she might have wished for, but something to hold on to, a piece of closure she hadn't expected to receive. "What will you do now?" Yates asked, the question that had been hanging between them since the letter from Mr. Hargrove arrived. Grace looked up at him, seeing the uncertainty in his eyes, the careful way he was holding himself, as if preparing for a blow. And suddenly, she knew the answer with perfect clarity. "I'm going to settle my father's affairs," she said, "and then I'm coming home, to the ranch, if that's still where I belong." The tension in Yates' shoulders eased visibly. "It is," he said simply, "for as long as you want it to be." There was more to say, feelings to acknowledge that had been growing between them for months, but this wasn't the time or place. For now, it was enough to know that she had a home to return to, people who wanted her there. The next several days were a whirlwind of activity as Grace navigated the complexities of her inheritance. There were papers to sign, decisions to make, meetings with her father's business associates who clearly expected her to defer to their judgment now that she was in charge. They were quickly disabused of this notion. Grace may have spent the last several months cooking, cleaning, and tending garden on a ranch, but she had grown up listening to her father discuss business at the dinner table. She understood more than anyone gave her credit for, and what she didn't know, she was determined to learn. Yates accompanied her to every meeting, a silent support whose presence gave her confidence. He said little, but his sharp eyes missed nothing, and in the privacy of their hotel rooms each evening, he offered observations that helped Grace see through the sometimes obsequious flattery of men who underestimated her. On their 5th day in Phoenix, as they were returning to the hotel after a particularly trying meeting with the railroad board, they were intercepted by a familiar figure on the sidewalk outside a fashionable restaurant. "Grace Verrill," said a cultured voice. "I thought that was you." Grace turned to see Harold Wellington, impeccably dressed as always, his thin face wearing an expression of calculated sympathy. "Harold," she acknowledged with a nod. "How are you?" "Well enough," he replied, his gaze sliding to Yates with obvious assessment. "And yourself?" "I was sorry to hear about your father." "Thank you," Grace said, the words automatic. "Harold, this is Yates Jenkins. Yates, Harold Wellington." The two men sized each other up, the contrast between them striking Harold in his tailored suit and polished shoes. Yates in his serviceable clothes that, while clean and proper for town, clearly belonged to a working man. "Mr. Jenkins," Harold said with the faintest emphasis on the Mr., as if conferring a title he didn't believe was deserved. "Are you a business associate of Grace's?" Before Yates could answer, Grace spoke. "Mr. Jenkins is my friend and my employer until recently." Harold's eyebrows rose. "Employer, surely you jest. What possible employment could a Verrill find with?" He trailed off, the implication clear in his dismissive glance at Yates' weathered hands. "I work as a housekeeper and tutor on Mr. Jenkins' ranch," Grace said evenly. "It has been both a pleasure and an education." Harold's expression shifted from surprise to calculation. "I see. Well, now that you've come into your inheritance, I imagine such arrangements will be unnecessary. In fact, I was hoping we might discuss the possibility of renewing our understanding." It took Grace a moment to realize what he was suggesting, that with her father gone and her financial situation secure, she might now be amenable to the match that had been arranged for her. "There is no understanding to renew, Harold," she said, keeping her voice level despite the anger building inside her. "There never was, except in my father's mind and yours." Harold's smile tightened. "Don't be hasty, Grace. You're in a vulnerable position now, a young woman alone with substantial assets to manage. You need protection, guidance. My offer stands." "Miss Verrill isn't alone," Yates said, speaking for the first time, his deep voice carrying the quiet authority of a man used to being heated. "And she's doing just fine managing her affairs." Harold's gaze snapped to Yates, a flash of genuine dislike crossing his features before he mastered himself. "I wasn't addressing you," he said coldly. "This is a private matter between Grace and myself." "There is no private matter," Grace interjected, "and I am neither vulnerable nor in need of the kind of protection you're offering." "Good day, Harold." She turned to go, but Harold caught her arm, his fingers pressing into her sleeve. "Don't be a fool, Grace, whatever dalliance you've been enjoying with this cowboy, it's time to come back to reality. You're Edmund Verrill's daughter, you have responsibilities to your position, your class." Yates moved so quickly that neither Grace nor Harold had time to react. One moment Harold's hand was on Grace's arm, the next, Yates had broken his grip and stepped between them, his posture protective but not threatening. "Miss Verrill said good day," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. For a tense moment, the three of them stood frozen on the sidewalk, passers-by giving them curious glances. Then Harold straightened his cuffs with exaggerated care, his face a mask of disdain. "I see how it is," he said to Grace. "You haven't changed at all." Still throwing away opportunities for inappropriate attachments. Your father would be disappointed. The words were calculated to wound, and a few months ago they might have. But Grace had read her father's letter, had come to understand that his true disappointment had been in himself, not her. "No, Harold," she said quietly. "My father would be proud that I've found people who value me for myself, not for my fortune or my family name." She took Yates' arm. "Shall we go? I believe we've said all there is to say here." As they walked away, Grace could feel Harold's gaze burning into her back, but she didn't turn around. The encounter had clarified something for her, bringing into sharp focus the difference between the life she had left behind and the one she had found. "You all right?" Yates asked as they turned a corner, his concern evident in the furrow of his brow. Grace nodded. "Better than all right, I feel free." She looked up at him, seeing the strength and kindness in his face that had become so dear to her. "Harold represented everything my father wanted for me: security, social position, a proper match. For so long I thought refusing that was what cost me my family, but I was wrong." "How so?" Yates asked, his eyes intent on her face. "My father's letter made me see that it wasn't my refusal that separated us, but his pride, and meeting Harold again." She shook her head. "He never saw me, not really, just what I represented: a connection to the Verrill name and fortune, but you." She hesitated, then continued softly, "You saw me when I was nothing but a stranger with a valise, and you offered me a place in your home, your family." Yates stopped walking, turning to face her fully. In his eyes, Grace saw a depth of feeling that took her breath away. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you were never nothing, not to me. From that first day, I saw someone brave enough to start over with nothing but the clothes on her back. Someone who treated Emma like she mattered, who worked without complaint, who brought life back into a house that had been just a place to sleep for too long." He took her hands in his, unmindful of the curious glances from people passing by. "I don't have much to offer compared to what you've inherited. Just a ranch that turns a modest profit, a house that needs a woman's touch, and a heart that's been yours since that first apple pie." Grace felt tears well in her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "That's everything," she whispered. "That's all I want." Yates' smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Then it's yours, all of it, especially the heart part." In that moment, on a Phoenix sidewalk with the afternoon sun painting everything in gold, Grace felt the last pieces of her broken heart finally heal. She had lost so much: her mother years ago, Matthew to violence, her father to pride and then death. But she had found something precious in the most unexpected place, a family created by choice rather than blood, bound by love rather than obligation. "Take me home, Yates," she said softly. "Back to the ranch, back to Emma, that's where I belong now." The journey back to Eagar seemed shorter somehow, the familiar landscape welcoming them as they traveled north. Grace had spent her last days in Phoenix settling her affairs, arranging for Mr. Hargrove to manage the sale of her father's house, establishing herself as the primary shareholder in the railroad company, and setting up accounts that would allow her to access her funds from the bank in Eagar. She had visited her father's grave, a solitary marker in the cemetery where her mother was also buried. The finality of seeing his name carved in stone had brought a fresh wave of grief, but also a sense of closure. She had said her goodbyes, not just to him, but to the life she had once expected to lead. Now, as the stagecoach bounced along the rough road toward Eagar, Grace felt a growing sense of anticipation. Beside her, Yates seemed equally eager to return, his hand occasionally finding hers in a gesture that had become familiar and dear. They hadn't spoken much more about the feelings they had acknowledged in Phoenix, both seeming to understand that such conversations were better held in privacy, away from the curious ears of fellow stagecoach passengers. But the knowledge was there between them, a shared secret that warmed Grace from within. As they crested the final hill before the ranch came into view, Grace leaned forward eagerly. The sight of the house, the barn, the corrals spread before her filled her with a joy she hadn't expected. This was home now in a way her father's grand mansion had never been, Emma must have been watching for them because the front door flew open before the wagon had fully stopped in the yard. She raced toward them, her face alight with excitement. "You're back," she cried, launching herself at Yates as he climbed down. He caught her with a laugh, swinging her in a circle before setting her back on her feet. "We sure are, Squirt," he said affectionately. "Did you behave for Miss Sarah?" "Mostly," Emma replied with disarming honesty. Her attention shifted to Grace, who was now standing beside the wagon. There was a moment of hesitation before Emma moved forward and wrapped her arms around Grace's waist in a fierce hug. "I missed you," the child admitted against Grace's skirt. Grace's heart swelled as she returned the embrace. "I missed you too, Emma, very much." Emma looked up, her expression suddenly anxious. "Are you staying? Sarah said you might not come back 'cause you're rich now and don't need to work anymore." Grace shot a glance at Yates, who was watching the exchange with a tender expression. "I am staying," she assured Emma. "This is where I want to be, with you and Yates and everyone here." The relief on Emma's face was palpable. "Good," she declared. "'Cause Yates was awful grumpy when you weren't here before, and I don't want him like that all the time." Yates coughed, a suspicious flush rising on his neck. "I wasn't grumpy." "You were too," Emma insisted. "Like a bear with a sore paw, that's what Hank said." Grace couldn't help laughing at Yates' embarrassed expression. "Well, I'm back now, so hopefully there will be no more grumpiness." "There's something else we need to tell you, Emma," Yates said, moving to stand beside Grace. "Something important." Emma looked between them, her eyes widening. "Are you getting married? 'Cause Sarah said you might and that I'd get to be in the wedding if you did." It was Grace's turn to blush. She and Yates hadn't actually discussed marriage yet, though the implication had been clear in their conversation in Phoenix. Yates cleared his throat. "Well, I haven't exactly asked Miss Grace properly yet, but I was planning to." He glanced at Grace, a question in his eyes. "Unless you think it's too soon." Grace shook her head, her heart too full for words. It wasn't too soon. It felt like the natural continuation of a journey that had begun the moment he had found her standing alone at the edge of town with nowhere to go. "So you are getting married?" Emma exclaimed. "When can I wear a pretty dress? Will there be cake?" Yates laughed, the sound rich with happiness. "Slow down, Squirt. Let me ask her properly first, then we can talk about dresses and cake." That evening, after Emma had finally been persuaded to go to bed despite her excitement, Yates and Grace sat on the porch swing, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The air was cool with the promise of autumn, and Grace had a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "I meant what I said earlier," Yates said, breaking the comfortable silence. "About asking you properly, I just didn't want to assume." Grace smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You weren't assuming anything I hadn't already decided." Yates turned slightly to look at her, his expression serious despite the joy in his eyes. "I need to be sure you understand what you'd be choosing, Grace. This isn't Phoenix. It's a working ranch, and even with your inheritance, it will never be as comfortable or grand as what you grew up with." "I know that," Grace said softly, "and I don't want grand, I want real. I want this the house that smells like pine smoke and coffee in the morning." Emma's laughter, the way the light falls across the fields at sunset. She paused, gathering her courage. "I want you, Yates. Your strength, your kindness, your heart." In the silvery moonlight, she saw his eyes darken with emotion. "You have my heart already," he said, his voice low and rough. "You've had it for months." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the starlight. "I got this in Phoenix," he explained. "It's not fancy, but I saw it in a shop window and thought of you." The ring was a simple band of gold set with a small pearl. It wasn't ostentatious like the diamond Harold would have offered, but it was perfect, elegant, and unpretentious, like the man who had chosen it. "Grace Verrill," Yates said, taking her hand in his. "Will you marry me? Be my wife, Emma's mother, and make this ranch a true home?" "Yes," Grace whispered, feeling as if her heart might burst with happiness. "Yes to all of it." Yates slipped the ring onto her finger, then cupped her face in his hands with infinite tenderness. When his lips met hers, Grace felt as if everything in her life had been leading to this moment, every joy, every sorrow, every choice both good and bad that had brought her to this porch, this man, this future that stretched before them full of promise. The kiss deepened, a pledge and a promise wrapped in the sweet ache of desire finally acknowledged. When they finally parted, both breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Grace," he said simply. "Have since that first apple pie, I think," Grace laughed softly. "And I love you, though it took me a bit longer to admit it to myself." "We've got time," Yates assured her. "All the time in the world." The wedding took place 3 weeks later, a simple ceremony in the church in Eagar followed by a celebration at the ranch that drew people from miles around. Grace wore a gown of ivory silk, ordered from Phoenix but altered by her own hands to better suit the occasion. Emma, resplendent in a new blue dress, served as her bridesmaid, taking the role with solemn pride. As Grace spoke her vows, her voice clear and sure in the hushed church, she thought of all the paths that had led her here. The loss of Matthew, which had devastated her but also freed her to find a different kind of love. Her father's rejection, which had forced her to discover her own strength. The journey to find her aunt, which had instead brought her to Yates and Emma, and a life she could never have imagined in Phoenix. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, and as Yates kissed her, sealing their union before God and their community, Grace felt the last pieces of her past settle into place. Not forgotten, but integrated into the tapestry of her life, each thread essential to the whole. The celebration afterward was joyous, with music and dancing and enough food to feed the entire county. Caleb and Sarah had come from town, bringing their children and a magnificent wedding cake. Sam Moore, now fully recovered save for his limp, played the fiddle while Hank called the dances. Even Mr. Hargrove had made the journey from Phoenix, bringing with him the final papers for Grace's inheritance and his genuine good wishes. As twilight fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a golden glow over the festivities. Grace found a moment to slip away to the porch, needing a brief respite from the happy chaos. She stood watching the celebration, her heart so full it felt like it might overflow. This was her family now, not by blood, but by choice. These people who had welcomed her, supported her, loved her for herself rather than her name or fortune. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Jenkins," came Yates' voice as he joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. Grace leaned into his embrace, savoring the newness of being called by his name. "I was thinking about family," she said. "About how sometimes the one we're born into isn't the one we're meant to have." Yates nodded, his chin brushing the top of her head. "My mother used to say that God gives us 2 families, the one we start with and the one we find along the way." "She was a wise woman," Grace said. "She would have loved you," Yates assured her. "Almost as much as Emma does, and not quite as much as I do." Grace turned in his arms, reaching up to trace the beloved lines of his face. "I never thought I could be this happy," she admitted. "After Matthew died and my father disowned me, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered." "And now," Yates prompted, his eyes warm in the lantern light, "now I know I found everything that truly matters," Grace replied. "A man who loves me for myself, a child who needs me, a home where I belong." The sound of Emma's laughter carried across the yard, bright and clear in the evening air. Grace smiled, thinking of the future that stretched before them, the years of watching Emma grow, perhaps more children to love, the ranch prospering under their combined care. Her father's fortune would help, of course. Already she and Yates had plans for improvements to the ranch, a larger herd, better breeding stock, expansions to the house. But the money was secondary to the life they would build together, a life rich in ways that had nothing to do with gold or property. "Should we rejoin the party?" Grace asked. "I believe you promised me another dance." Yates smiled, the expression transforming his face with boyish charm. "I did at that. Can't have my wife thinking I don't keep my promises on our very first day of marriage." As they moved back toward the dancing, hand in hand, Grace felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a blessing. She had lost her birth family, true, but in their place, she had found something perhaps even more precious, a family created by choice, bound by love, stronger for having been forged in adversity rather than merely inherited. Her father had disowned her for loving the wrong man, but Yates had said, "Be part of my family." And in accepting that invitation, Grace had found not just a home or a husband, but her true place in the world. It was enough. It was everything. In the years that followed, the Jenkins ranch flourished. Grace's inheritance allowed for expansions and improvements that would have taken decades otherwise, but it was the family itself that truly thrived. Emma blossomed under the combined influence of Yates' steady guidance and Grace's gentle nurturing. The wild, wary child gradually gave way to a confident young woman with her adoptive father's sense of justice and her adoptive mother's compassion. A year after the wedding, Grace gave birth to a son they named William, after Yates' father. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, named Martha in honor of Grace's aunt, who had unwittingly brought her to Eagar. The house, once so quiet that Yates had found it oppressive after his first wife's death, now rang with children's laughter and the everyday sounds of a happy family. Grace never regretted her decision to leave behind the wealth and social position she had been born to. The money was useful. Yes, it funded a new school in Eagar, helped neighbors through hard times, ensured that no child in the county went without education or opportunity if she could help it. But it was the life she had built with Yates that brought her true joy. Sometimes, on summer evenings when the work was done and the children were playing in the yard, Grace and Yates would sit on the porch swing just as they had on the night of his proposal. They would watch the sun set over land that had become more beautiful to Grace than any city vista, and she would marvel at the journey that had brought her here. "Any regrets?" Yates would sometimes ask, his arm warm around her shoulders. And Grace would look at the man who had offered her a place in his family when she had none, at the children they had raised together, at the home they had built, and she would answer with perfect truth, "Not a single one."